Welcome back to History 262, Intro to Africa. Today's lecture will be discussing a number of things. I want to talk about some key issues in the study of African history. I want to talk a little bit about historiography, and I'll explain, if you're unfamiliar with that term, I'll explain what that means. As I'm waiting for the PowerPoint to come up here. And I also want to talk about the geography of Africa, which is a key factor in the way that human societies take shape there. And then conclude with some discussion about the politics and economics of Africa, kind of writ large, on a general scale. So that's where we're headed with this, and this is the sort of class that I like to interact with my students and talk with them, but circumstances here dictate that that's simply not possible. Maybe when I get back and we actually start having class, that can be, we can come back and reapproach some of these things. There are a number of terms that get used frequently in discussing Africa that we should pause and think about. There are also a number of terms that don't necessarily get used to talk about Africa, or they do in ways that are problematic. To start this discussion, rather than go to these terms directly, I want to take a look at what has become now a pretty famous quote. In 1963, the famous British historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who was the Regius Professor at the Regius Professor of modern European history at the University of Oxford. He later went to Cambridge. So really one of the most widely respected historians of the 20th century, gave some lectures where he brought up the topic of African history, and he said some things that are pretty controversial. And so I've found this on a blog. The blog really isn't important here. What is important is the quote. So he said, and this was just over 50 years ago still, it is fashionable to speak today as if European history were devalued. Now really in other words, he's trying to argue that European history is very valuable. So that's the frame for this, okay? As if historians in the past have paid too much attention to it, and as if nowadays we should pay less. Undergraduates, seduced as always by the changing breadth of journalistic fashion, demand that they should be taught the history of Black Africa. And then comes the controversial part. He says, perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach. But at present there is none or very little. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is largely darkness, like the history of pre-European, pre-Columbian America, and darkness is not a subject for history. So according to Hugh Trevor Roper, 54 years ago, Africa has no history except for the history of Europeans in Africa. Now, he goes on to say, please do not misunderstand me. I do not deny that men existed even in dark countries and dark centuries. The word dark there is highly problematic, but we can maybe discuss that later. Nor that they had political life and culture interesting to sociologists and anthropologists, but history, I believe, is essentially a form of movement and purposive movement, too. It is not a mere phantasmagoria of changing shapes and costumes, of battles and conquests, dynasties and usurpations, social forms and social disintegration. If all history is equal, as some now believe, there is no reason why we should study one section of it rather than another, for certainly we cannot study it all. Then indeed we may neglect our own history and amuse ourselves with and this is the really kind of controversial sentence here, with the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. Tribes whose chief function in history, in my opinion, is to show the present to the present an image of the past from which by history it has escaped. Now, let's set aside the kind of inherent racial thinking here, and confront the issue of that Hugh Trevor Roper is discussing, or that he's bringing up here. Why would he say Africa has no history? Well, it largely depends on the definition of the word history. For Hugh Trevor Roper, he's thinking in terms of professional history. That is the kind of history that historians do. He's not saying there was no passage of time in Africa. He was saying that historians cannot access, using the tools that they have and the methodologies they have formulated, they cannot access the history of Africa. And here we really need to go back to the early 19th century and the foundations of history as a discipline, which emphasized the use of documents for the constructing of history. Now, the problem here, of course, is that Africa did not produce a lot of documents, at least not written documents. And so, by the strictest of definitions of history here, Africa does have no history. One cannot go to the archives of the medieval kingdom of Mali, for instance, or of the kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, or one of these large political entities that existed in previous centuries in Africa, and find documents and construct the history of Africa from those documents. Well, truth be told, the only parts of the world that produce things like that, for the most part, are Europe and the countries influenced by Europe, right? And if we cut ourselves off from the study of the African past, simply because there are no written documents, then we really miss out on opportunities to understand a people and to develop critical thinking skills and other things necessary that could come from pursuing that study. So one of the questions we have to raise is, okay, if Africa doesn't have any written sources, or very few written sources, how do we access it? After all, I think it is important that historians use primary sources. They need to get at the kinds of sources that existed in previous centuries, and whatever part of history we're looking at, the sources that come from that era, to find what the people from that period had to say for themselves and about themselves. Well, Africa doesn't produce a lot of written documents, so we have to look at other kinds of sources. And that's one of the things that I'm going to discuss here in a few minutes. So, the other main point here that I want you to take away from this is this sort of controversial take on African history, right? The notion that Africa is so primitive and, is really just, as he says, the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. That Africa really has nothing to offer that is interesting or insightful, no purposive history, as Hugh Trevor Roper puts it, right? And I want to call him out on this, right? I do think that there is plenty in African history that we can discover that is interesting, rewarding, that is purposive, that has a purpose to it in some way. So let's think about those things as we go about our study of African history this semester, or this term. Now, if the word history is problematic, well, the word civilization is similarly problematic, right? Africa did have a civilization, or rather, that word needs to be plural, civilizations. The African continent is huge and highly diverse, and so to speak of a single civilization of Africa is highly problematic. We're going to talk about geography later, and we'll see that Africa has a tremendously varied geography and topography. And so we need to use the word civilization in plural. Now, civilization is a large-scale human society with great complexity. That term certainly applies to Africa. However, even in places that do not approach the kind of complexity that we tend to associate with civilizations, there's still plenty to learn, and there's still plenty of history there. We just need to be creative in the way that we approach it. Other terms have been used often in conjunction with thinking about the African continent. The word primitive, for instance, is a big one, right? This place is primitive. We might even throw the word dark in there, or backward, or savage, or perhaps barbaric, or something like that. This has often been the way that Africa has been described, certainly by Europeans. But the word primitive, I think we just need to jettison that from our historical lexicon here and examine the various peoples of Africa on their own terms without the assumption, and this goes back to some of the things I wrote in the syllabus, without the assumption that that is, we Westerners, we who are derived from European civilization, are superior to them, or that we have progressed further than them, right? We're going to find that there are civilizations or societies that existed in Africa many centuries ago that were highly successful, that somehow managed to encounter a difficult climate, difficult geography, difficult topography, and yet thrived in those circumstances and accomplished really amazing things. A word that often goes along with primitive is tribe, or the adjectival form of that, which is tribal, right? That's a word I don't like very much because it has so many pejorative connotations. When we talk about tribes, we tend to think in terms of primitive or less advanced. Now, there are certainly ties of kinship and other things that we tend to associate with the word tribe that apply to African history, that are relevant to African history. And so we might occasionally refer to that. I will use words probably like groups or ethnicities or something rather than tribes. I'll try to do that in any case, so that we get away from the pejorative associations here. The word race has a great deal of potency to it, obviously, and it's probably one that you're familiar with. Pardon me while I close this update. I do not need a new version of DivX, and now my computer's thinking that I don't need to have access to that. In any case, okay, so we're back. So the word race is not one that I think we will use very much in this course. Rather, the word ethnicity, or simply the word society or civilization or something like that, as one society in Africa distinguished from another society in Africa, or one ethnic identifier. Race is maybe a term that is relevant for the interaction between Africans and others, which comes rather late in its history. And it's certainly a term with a great deal of meaning, a great deal of potency, and probably some damaging pejorative connotations. And so we will frequently use the word ethnicity, though we should be warned even there that the word ethnicity is problematic, because what we call ethnicities, we tend to think are these solidified things that have existed from time out of mind, that people have these ethnic identifiers that, once a Gikuyu or an Igbo or a Hutu or something like that, or a Zulu, always a Zulu, that goes back to time immemorial. And the reality is that these ethnicities are very fluid all through African history. That in one generation people will identify with one particular group, and then there might be a momentous happening or just gradual change that causes, in the generations to follow, the posterity of those who once identified with one particular ethnicity to identify with another ethnicity entirely. There's a lot of linguistic evolution in this period. So ethnicities are often associated with particular languages. And we're going to talk about the linguistic diversity of Africa, which comes as a result of the movements of peoples and the encounter with new environments, new things, new technologies, and so forth that hadn't been discovered before. And so, we need to recognize the tremendous, almost constant fluidity and development that goes on throughout these centuries and millennia that we're going to be discussing. Okay, shifting gears a little bit to talk about historiography. The term historiography means, really, it's kind of like the study of history, or rather the study of the ways that history has been conceived of. In other words, it's the history of historians, or something like that. And if you're a history major, you may be familiar with this term. If you're not, you may not be, or I don't know. It's a term that is quite important, and historians are constantly interacting with the work of other historians, and either arguing for what earlier historians have said or arguing against what they have said. And so we see the development of these ideas about history over time. Well, this is highly relevant to the study of African history because we need to go in with eyes wide open to this and recognize that lots of different people have weighed in on this, on the study of African history, and have said various variety of things about it. There are different groups of historians who have shaped the way that we conceive of this history. So let's talk about that. Now, the first thing that we need to comprehend is how we actually do African history. I've said, and I cannot underscore this point strongly enough, that historians must use primary sources. That is, things that come from the time period in question, to talk about this. In other words, or to write the history, to craft and construct the history that they are interested in. And the sources for African history are highly varied, but they tend to be somewhat non-traditional. That is, they aren't your typical fare for primary sources. Written documents are few and far between. Now, there are some parts of Africa that did develop written languages. The ancient Egyptians, and let's not forget that Egypt is firmly inside of the African continent. The ancient Egyptians developed first a pictographic writing system called hieroglyphics. Later on, developed a more logographic, put simply, a kind of symbolic writing system known as demotic. And then, later on, the Phoenician, or the phonetic alphabet made its way. Various phonetic alphabets made their way into Egypt and other parts of North Africa. Greek, later Arabic with the expansion of Islam. And so these were literate peoples. There were, literate Quranic schools, for instance, thriving along the Niger River in West Africa for many centuries, going back probably to about the 13th century. And so these peoples, these various places in Africa, produced written documents. Ethiopia is another good example. It was Christian from about the 4th century CE on. Brief side note, I tend to use CE and BCE in talking about history, so as not to privilege one religion over another or one cultural system over another. You are welcome to use BC and AD if that's more comfortable to you. It means exactly the same thing. So from about the 4th century CE on, Ethiopia was Christian, and they learned, or they of course had sacred Christian texts like the Bible, but they also began to produce their own Christian texts in the languages of Ethiopia, Ge'ez, and later Amharic. And so that's another place that has written documents. So we do have a good amount of written primary sources, at least in parts of Africa. But these must always be supplemented with other things. Archaeology is important here. Though it's difficult to do archaeology in the African continent because for most of its history, Africa was a highly underpopulated continent. And so large swaths of land saw no human societies in them. And so just going out and digging a random trench and hoping to find human remains is not necessarily the best way to spend one's time. So, now there are places that have been excavated archaeologically where we've discovered a great deal of information. And so this is an ongoing study, but it's tricky. And so even that must be probably supplemented with other things. Oral sources. In parts of Africa, in fact many parts of Africa, probably most famously in these characters known as the griots of West Africa. And we'll learn more about griots later on when we read the Tale of Sundiata partway through the semester. But griots were the lore keepers, the oral traditionalists of their societies, and they were in societies all over West Africa for about the last 1,000 years or more. And they passed these stories on from one generation to another. Now, obviously, over time, these things got modified as people, sought creative license to modify the stories. But there was something sacred about this lore such that they were reluctant, probably, to modify it. Starting in the 20th century, historians and anthropologists began to talk with these griots and began to learn these legends, and some of them were even translated. Like, for instance, the Tale of Sundiata was translated, and editions in European languages of this text were produced. Oral traditions, sorry for the yawn there. Oral traditions tend to be problematic methodologically because we have to recognize the probability of change over time, but we can start to detect through critical means some of the authenticity of the stories as they describe real historical events that took place at some point in the past. And there are, lots of scholars who have worked on oral tradition and have formulated ideas about how this is to be done properly. So we'll do a little bit of that with Tale of Sundiata and some other things. And going along with that would just be the more kind of widespread culture of the folklore, the traditions of peoples, and we can study peoples of Africa anthropologically, and this has of course been done for the last several centuries as Europeans have gone into Africa and starting with the Christian missionaries as early as the 16th century in sub-Saharan Africa around the Congo River. They wrote down what they observed. They interviewed people. They learned the local languages, and from those ethnographies that they produced, the studies of the peoples, the cultures of the peoples, we can pick through that and look for information that might be helpful in constructing the history. Art, in some places the African art is very rich, and we can learn a lot from that, and even going all the way back into Neolithic times with things like rock paintings and cave paintings and other things all the way up through the present. There's a rich tradition of art in Africa, and that can be used as primary source. Another one that has been utilized by a group of very creative, very hard-working scholars is linguistic evidence. Now, this is not something that I require my students to do because it's tremendously complicated. But historians have collected, they pair up with linguists often in this endeavor. Historians like Jan van Sina, who taught for many years at the University of Wisconsin, or Christopher Ehret, who taught at UCLA. The two of those, by the way, didn't particularly get along, but that's sort of inside baseball for historians. They would collect these sets of languages that were related to each other, that shared a common kind of core vocabulary. And the theory here is that all of these languages developed from a single language at some point in the distant past. And then as we trace the development of these languages, we look at the words they have in common, we might be able to detect, and I think we can detect, changes that occurred in the past. So for instance, as the Bantu peoples We're going to talk about who they were a bit later on in a future lecture. But the Bantu peoples began to migrate from their place of origin in West Africa down into the equatorial rainforest of Africa, sometimes skirting the rainforest on the northern edge, and then moving down the eastern side of it, sometimes entering directly into the rainforest, probably about 3,000 years ago or so. Maybe a little bit before that even. And as they moved, they encountered things that they hadn't known about before. Plants and animals that they were not acquainted with before those migrations. And they developed technologies like tools that they would use in farming and other things. They developed iron technology during this time. They began to cultivate, at least in the Great Plains of East Africa, began to cultivate cereal crops, which they hadn't had access to before. And as they did this, they developed vocabularies for these things that didn't exist in the earlier languages. So, if we gather a data set, and one of Jan van Siena's studies, I think he has a data set of 44 distinct languages, and he, kind of goes back and constructs their base vocabulary, and then looks at the way these things developed. Well, this is called historical linguistics. It's very complicated, as I said. It's difficult. I greatly admire and am sort of in awe of those who do this kind of history. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, as it were. And we've been able to learn a great deal about even the distant past from this. Now, there is a huge element of speculation in this. These historians are making imaginative leaps from one piece of evidence to another, and they will probably be the first to tell you that none of this is certain, but it does enable us to access in some way even the very distant past. Finally, biological evidence. We can look at human remains, for instance, or we can look at, genetic information in living human beings and begin to construct something about the past. Why did people end up with particular genes, or with immunities to certain diseases, or lack of immunity to other diseases, or maybe proclivities for certain conditions or something like that, and that will give us information about the past. So we need to bring all of these kinds of things to bear in the study of Africa, or rather, historians have used these various kinds of sources. And you can see that many of these are not so straightforward. They take a lot of creativity to access. Another thing we should say about historiography here, and this is getting into the actual crafting of the history by historians, is that there are a lot of differences between European takes on African history and African takes, or Afrocentric understandings of African history. Okay. The earliest historians to work in a professional capacity on African history were Europeans. We could say all the way back into the 19th century, when history first became professionalized as a discipline. And one of the prevailing ideas of that day was the notion of progressivism, that peoples over time develop from, and there are kind of these three stages that were laid out in the 19th century, from a savage condition marked by really a lack of any kind of large-scale society, where it's a dog-eat-dog world. People are, it's kill or be killed, and the search for food is constant, and all people are really concerned about is food and shelter and sex and other things like that. And they move then to a stage of barbarism where there is some political complexity, but only really for the sake of warfare and conquering other peoples with larger armies. And the Europeans said, human beings must move beyond that stage into what they call civilization. And by their reckoning, Europeans were the only ones who had reached this point, right? Well, that influenced definitely the way that African history was viewed by Europeans. In fact, of all of the places in the world, Africa was probably castigated the most for being still in a savage condition. They probably would have also put the Native Americans and probably the Australian Aborigines and other peoples like that into that category, but Africa was seen as a very savage place, and that's not terribly helpful in the construction of African history. We also have the presence of scientific racism, even to some extent the polygenesis theory, which with the discoveries of Charles Darwin in the mid-19th century and the whole notion of natural selection and evolution, there were many who proposed that Africans actually were a different species of human being, inferior in every measurable way except maybe physically, in terms of physical strength, in every way to Europeans, right? That idea has been disproven, but you know, there's still justifications given for racism on a scientific basis. So that gets in the way. That's gotten in the way, definitely, of the study of African history. To some extent, I think we can still see that bias in the work of Hugh Trevor Roper, those quotes that I read earlier. The notion of the dark continent, again, back to Trevor Roper, who used that terminology. Africa was the last place, and that's kind of ironic because Africa is proximate to Europe, but it was the last place that Europeans made an effort to penetrate and to comprehend. It was the final frontier, to borrow words from Star Trek there. The last place that the Europeans were interested in, a place of, again, great savagery and danger and intrigue, where only the bravest souls would venture. European explorers and scholars of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were hailed as great heroes when they tried to penetrate this vast and dark continent. Those perceptions bias in every way the interpretation of African history, and they must simply be jettisoned if we're going to do this productively. Europeans also felt that it was their responsibility to civilize Africa. Rudyard Kipling famously penned his poem The White Man's Burden, where he says, you know, we've got to take to these dark and savage peoples Christianity and advanced civilization and notions of humanity and independence and liberty and all of these things the Europeans celebrated. We've got to take those to these people at great sacrifice to ourselves. Well, if that's the assumption you have going into this, African history is not going to be, it's going to be inherently biased again, right? There's also the influence of the American setting on the study of African history, and that's something we cannot discount, particularly as the civil rights movement, achieved some success in the 1960s, as people got in touch with their African roots, as people who were descended from former slaves, that is, got in touch with their African roots. They began to construct for themselves images of Africa, and this sort of errs in the other direction. Overly sentimental, idyllic notions of these halcyon days of living in Africa and enjoying this free existence and all of this. This was built up in the 1970s with the novel Roots by Alex Haley, which was made into a very successful miniseries in the late 1970s, watched by huge numbers of Americans. One of the most watched programs in all of television history. And so that created this kind of idyllic notion of Africa, and that I don't think is very helpful either, honestly. So we need to find some kind of middle ground between those extremes, and this is where African historiography comes in. Starting in the 1960s and really getting going in the 1970s, there's this trend toward what's called Afrocentrist thought. And the argument here is mostly from Africans themselves, though there certainly were American and European scholars who participated in this, also peoples from people from the African diaspora, that is, scholars from the Caribbean and other places, got involved in Afrocentrist thinking. One of the key proponents of this actually was Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor, who wrote extensively on this and even produced some documentaries and other things about African history, really about the history of the history of the black man. Now, Afrocentric history was not necessarily new, because there were native officials in the colonial era who crafted local histories once they learned European languages. They published memoirs about their own experience, about their own people. We're actually going to read The Dark Child later this term. That's one of the assigned primary sources. And Kamar Lai was one of these European educated Africans who, wrote this memoir of his life, really it's a novel kind of, but it's really kind of a first-hand account of his experience. This was his attempt to depict what he went through as a child, the kind of life that was lived in his part of Africa. And so that's the origin of this African historiography, I think. Those are some of the earliest ideas there. With independence movements in the 1950s and 60s, as these African places were trying to throw off the colonial yoke and to become independent from their European overlords, they demanded some teaching and research into their history, rather than be taught the history of Europeans and the notion that Europeans were inherently dominant. They wanted to learn about their own people. And so in the 1960s and 70s, we see the rearing up of this Afrocentrist thinking, and this coincides with the establishment of universities in Africa, which become these bastions for Afrocentrist thinking. Now, in some cases, especially in the early years of Afrocentrist thought, we find fairly problematic things. One of the great examples of this is the work of a Senegalese historian named Cheikh Anta Diop, who wrote a series of works, his most famous theories came in the form of proposing that Africans were the true originators of world civilization because Egypt is in Africa, and Egypt, he says, was influential on all of Africa. If Western civilization is descended from the Greeks, he said, African civilization, and he used that, I think, in the singular, was descended from the Egyptians. And so he began to look for evidence that the Egyptians had influenced the rest of Africa and that all of their societies were of ancient date. And this ended up being very much an exercise in free association, where he would find statues or references in oral legends or something that sounded kind of like or looked kind of like Egyptian stuff, and he would say, see, the Egyptians originated all of this. This has mostly been discounted, but I think that was an important stage in African historiography. And it's one that, I think the momentum from that has propelled the study of African history into the present, and with historians that are far more careful than Diop or some of these early first-generation Afrocentrist thinkers, have moved in productive directions here. Another strain of Afrocentrist thinking was the notion of underdevelopment, that in fact the Europeans had purposefully underdeveloped Africa, made sure that it continued to be inferior. And with this comes an emphasis on economic history, on the history of economics in Africa. Now, this Afrocentric thinking has had a productive influence on Western scholarship, in that historians working on African history have, rather than compared African history to European history, have simply tried to encounter and understand Africa on its own terms. And that's really where this class lies. It's not about saying that Africa is less developed or more developed or developed differently than Europe. It's really to leave Europe and its the countries it influences, completely to the side and try to explore how Africa developed itself, or rather, because as we've said, this is a diverse continent, how the various and highly varied peoples of Africa have developed over time. Recent scholarship has emphasized things like environmental issues and social issues, and so we'll spend a good deal of time exploring those kinds of things. Okay, at this point I would ask if there are questions, and hopefully we would have a discussion from there. But as I do not have you present with me here, I'm simply going to press on and talk for a few minutes about the geography of Africa, which is a tremendously important component of the understanding of Africa in general. You can see from this composite satellite image of Africa that the topography is highly varied. We have, on the one hand, the largest desert in the world here, the Sahara Desert. It is not the driest desert in the world, it should be said. I think the Atacama in South America gets the lowest amount of rainfall. There are parts of the Sahara, in fact, that in the past have been quite fertile, the very distant past, but there are remnants of bodies of water that were once much larger. Lake Chad here in the middle of the Sahara, for instance, used to be vastly larger, a huge inland lake. It has shrunk considerably in size with the desiccation of the Sahara. And so this has not always been the constant, right? But for the most part, we have to reckon with this gigantic desert, which has a very powerful influence on the way that societies around the Sahara take shape. We also have, one of the densest rainforests in the world, really kind of along the Congo River here, right? And so that's one that we need to be aware of. And then down here we have another desert, the Kalahari, which is, I think, probably much drier in many ways than the Sahara is. But that's influential. And then there are these mountains, right? The Drakensberg Mountains down here. Africa has this feature that really is kind of unique called the Great Rift Valley, which is the movement of two tectonic plates, except these are moving away from each other, creating a gap here, which is filled in by these lakes, and really spectacular geographic features like Victoria Falls down here in what is now Zimbabwe, the result of the Great Rift Valley. And then, so we have Lake Victoria and the other Great Lakes of Africa, as they're called here. But along the Great Rift Valley, we also have, highlands and mountains, mountains reaching almost 20,000 feet over here on the Serengeti. The famous Toto song from, 1982 or 83 called Africa. Sure as Kilimanjaro rises like Olympus from the Serengeti. Right, and it truly does, but it also has glaciers on it and things like that. So there's a tremendous diversity of geography. One thing that we should note about African geography is that there's this pattern of bands of different kinds of topography. So on the far northern coast here, along the Mediterranean, we have a Mediterranean climate. That is a fairly temperate, decent amount of rainfall, good for agriculture kind of climate. And this historically, especially in ancient history, was one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the world, and it still has really good farmland in parts of it, at least today. Then that gives way to the Sahara. The Sahara in turn gives way to grassland, or savanna as it's called. The term for this, by the way, is the Sahel. This band that runs just to the south of the Sahara is called the Sahel. You'll see that on the geography quiz study sheet. That's what you should note. Then we have rainforest, pretty much all along the equator, and for some degrees latitude in either direction. Rainforest here along the coast of West Africa. The densest rainforest down here in the Congo River region, and then this gradually gives way again to grassland. Over here we have some highlands, the Ethiopian highlands, and then these high mountains up here, and the Great Rift Valley, which because it has soil that comes from deep inside of the Earth's crust, the soil is very fertile there. The land is some of the best in the world for agriculture, and we also have savanna over here with the Serengeti Plain. And so the rainforest gives way to savanna, to grassland. And then we have another desert, right? And then finally, all the way down here at the Cape of Good Hope, we have another kind of Mediterranean climate. Temperate, moderate amount of rainfall, decent for agriculture, and so forth and so on. And so it runs in this kind of reverse pattern of Mediterranean, desert, savanna, rainforest, savanna, desert, Mediterranean, right? I'm going to leave Madagascar completely out of this. In fact, we're not going to spend much time talking about this semester. Madagascar is kind of its own little continent to itself through much of this history. Another thing you should note about this is the proximity of Africa, or parts of Africa, to other places. The Red Sea is all that divides the Horn of Africa. This is the Horn here. You can see why it's called the Horn, right? The Horn of Africa and the what was Egypt and the Sudan region from the Arabian Peninsula, for instance. And naturally, there was a good deal of trade that went on between those two places, and eventually the spread of Islam into North Africa and East Africa happened from the Arabian Peninsula. Also, the Mediterranean was not a divider anciently; it was a uniter, and North Africa was intimately part of many ancient empires, particularly the Roman Empire. So Africa was not cut off so much from other parts of the world, at least at points in its distant past. Okay, now a couple of other things that we should note about the geography and topography and climate of the continent. You can see the mountains here, right? So you get the Atlas Mountains up here and the Ahagar Mountains and the Ethiopian highlands, and down here you have the Drakensberg and the mountains of the Great Rift Valley region and things like that, right? Southern Africa is made up largely of one huge plateau. High, arid, giving way to desert plateau, but this whole area is fairly high in elevation. So is Madagascar, by the way, as you can see here, right? The rest of it, the rainforest region, is close to sea level, as are most of the regions of West Africa. The rivers of Africa are tremendously important for its history, and so it's essential that we know these rivers. This is where civilizations developed, whether we're talking about the ancient Egyptians developing along the Nile, even all the way down here into the Sudan region. The Nile was absolutely vital, and over here into the Horn of Africa with the Blue Nile, that river was key to the development of societies there. The Niger River saw the rise of some fairly large medieval kingdoms, and we'll discuss those. And the Niger River very much was the lifeblood of those kingdoms. The Congo River that runs through the rainforest. This, by the way, is the river with the second. The Nile is the longest river in the world, but the Congo is like Africa's Amazon. It has a huge amount of water in it. It's not as long as the Amazon. The Amazon is the second longest river in the world, and it's the river with the most water in it because it, of course, is fed by the rainforest and all of the tremendous rainfall. Well, the Congo River is as well. When the Portuguese came sailing down the west coast of Africa in the 15th century, their boat was behaving strangely, was being pushed out to sea, even though they were well away from the landmass. And they took soundings in the water, they took samples of the water, and found that even miles out to sea, the water was fresh. There was not a trace of salt in it. That's because the Congo River was so swift and powerful and huge that it was creating this whole ecosystem out here well into the Atlantic. And so, the Congo River is a I mean, it's a powerful river. There are lots of rapids and other things along it, so it makes it difficult to traverse. The same is true, by the way, for the Zambezi, which is fed by the Great Rift Valley and Victoria Falls and some of these things. So, but it's not nearly as large as the Congo is. Okay, as long or has as much water in it. In places like southern Africa, where you have the Limpopo River up here and the Orange River here, where the land is more arid, those rivers are obviously very important for supplying water. Speaking of water, rainfall is really vital. There are certain levels of rainfall that will sustain agriculture. Above about 400 millimeters a year will sustain agriculture. So, let's look at the line here. It runs roughly through this part, I think. Anywhere under 200 millimeters a year will not even sustain the raising of livestock. And so we have regions that had human beings in them, or human beings who traversed them, like the Sahara and parts of the Kalahari, that had a lower rainfall than that, and these people had to learn how to survive in the desert, but they tended to, rather than develop large-scale societies, they hunted and gathered and other things like that. These lines are really important because, this line between agriculture, where agriculture is possible, and where the raising of livestock becomes the lifeblood of a society. That's an important line historically, and that's something that we need to be aware of and acknowledge. And we can see this in linguistics, that the people who live below the 400 millimeter threshold don't have vocabularies for agricultural things because they couldn't engage in it. On the other hand, they have lots of words for pastoralism, for the raising of domesticated animals, because that was the lifeblood of their civilization. Anyway, that's a thing that we need to be aware of constantly as we think about the variety of civilizations in Africa. Okay. Key concepts, and this is the last part of this lecture. Africa was, all through its history, really up until the last 150 years or so, one giant frontier. You can see that in the modern day there is a tremendous population density in parts of Africa, especially here in what is now Nigeria, which is the most populous of all of the countries of Africa, and in the Nile Valley up here in Egypt, all along the coast of what is now Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and then here around the Great Lakes region, where the richest soil is, and then down here in the urban centers of South Africa. Those are today the most densely populated places, but there are places with, like less than one person per square kilometer. Of course, most of these are deserts, but you can see that parts of it are sparsely populated. Now, if we were to somehow figure out how to measure this for 300 or 400 years ago, you would not see any of those darker areas. The whole continent was vastly underpopulated. What this meant, and this is something we'll discuss repeatedly through the first part of this course, what this meant was that there was always land available. Now, if the frontier, and by that I mean the conceptual frontier, the notion that there's something out there that I can go to, and there's virgin territory there, and I can take it and make a better life for myself, if that is one of the key factors in the movement of history, as some historians have posited, then Africa is rich with it, right? And this notion of the ever-present frontier is key to our understanding. Because Africa was so underpopulated, and the land was so abundant, it meant people didn't need to live in permanent societies if they didn't want to. Permanent societies are the exception rather than the rule.
In general terms, people didn't have to worry about the fertility of the soil. Once the soil stopped producing, they would simply pack up and move, a few kilometers away or something and start a new life in virgin soil and use that up until its nutrients were gone, until it stopped growing things, and then move to the next one, right? And so they're constantly moving. This is why Africans did not tend to build monumental architecture or produce kind of permanent settlements. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course. There are, in parts of Africa, long-standing civilizations, cities that have been there for century upon century, but in much of the continent, the frontier was always there, right? And so we've got to be aware of this underpopulation, the notion of population history. Africans developed what we call mobile agriculture. That is, they had a few simple tools that made it possible for them to do their agriculture anywhere they went. They didn't, develop the kinds of tools that are heavy and difficult to move. They didn't have pack animals and other things like that, because pack animals are subject to to lots and lots of diseases that are native to the African continent, and so they simply didn't survive in places. So pretty much people moved with whatever they themselves could carry. In fact, Africans really probably didn't develop wheel technology, and we might say, "Oh my gosh, how primitive can you be?" Right? But that's without understanding the the calculus involved in the human societies here. If they don't have pack animals, what's the use, or beasts of burden? What's the use of a wheel? Wheels are mostly for carts, mostly for carrying things. And if you don't have anything to pull a cart, well, you're never going to develop the wheel, right? And so whatever they could carry, Africans did develop really amazing abilities to carry huge loads, and I have some stories about that I'll share as we go on this semester, or as they're in this term. Politically speaking, the important thing we have to understand is that power and authority in Africa was not power and authority over land. In other words, people didn't lay claim to land and say, "This is mine, and I have it forever, and my people belong on this land, and that's never going to change," right? The idea of nationalism and other things makes it seem like this is an inherent in human societies. It's not. Power meant power over people. Those who were able to exert authority or power in African societies did so because they convinced people to perpetuate those structures of authority, to accept them as the people with power. Now, how could they do this? Well, it wasn't by granting them land, because land had no worth. Land was abundant. It was everywhere. Anyone could claim any piece of land they wanted, pretty much. They had to come up with different means to keep people together and to keep the power structures in place. And they often broke apart because if someone was dissatisfied with the way things were going, they could always pack up what few possessions they had, what few tools they had, and simply move away and start their own society. And societies were always moving and evolving, and the structures of power were changing on a constant basis. Now, we will talk in due course here about the means of keeping people in the same place, or keeping people together in some sort of hegemony, right? We brought up environmental history already. One of the key factors in African history is disease and famine, maybe to a little bit of a lesser extent, although it depends on the place. Diseases have had a profound impact on African history. Africa is the native land of a number of diseases that have, by turns, devastated the continent. One of the ones we should be aware, well, there are a couple. a couple from that go back to time immemorial, and a couple more that are more recent kinds of things. Malaria has been a constant in African history. People catch malaria, and lots of people certainly have died from this, and it's a terrible disease. But for people in Africa, it's kind of like getting the flu. Yes, it's bad, and yes, if a person is weak or old or very young, it could kill them, right? But for the most part, they simply learn to live with malaria. I remember several years ago, the famous soccer player Didier Drogba from Cote d'Ivoire. I can't remember which team he was playing for at the time. I think it was Chelsea in London. But he went home to Africa during the off season. He came back with malaria, and people said, "Well, how terrible that. Why did you go to Africa if you thought there was a possibility of you catching malaria?" And Drogba's response to this was, "What's the big deal? Right? Malaria is a constant in the lives of my people, right?" So, malaria it did have a devastating effect, obviously, repeatedly all through African history, but it's something they simply accepted that they had to live with. Another one that is really big is what's called trypanosomiasis, or African sleeping sickness. This is transmitted through a little insect called the tsetse fly, and pretty much it extends through most of sub-Saharan Africa. Anywhere where the rainfall line is greater than I can't remember what the level is exactly, tends to have tsetse fly infestations, and these flies bite, and they transmit this infection called trypanosomiasis, which is called African sleeping sickness because people go into essentially like coma if it gets really bad. Trypanosomiasis also affects, in fact, even more than it affects humans, it affects animals. And so large animals, livestock, things like cows and horses, and probably even things like sheep and goats, suffered from trypanosomiasis if they were exposed to it. And so there are large parts of Africa that simply did not have animals like that. They couldn't live through it. And so those societies took different shapes than others that are outside of the sleeping sickness zone. This kept the population, sorry for the yawn, kept the population in check, and made it absolutely certain that Africa would be tremendously underpopulated. That said, Africa was not entirely cut off all through its history from the Eurasian Old World, as we might call it, the world of what is now Europe and the Middle East. Was linked sometimes in intimate, very close ways, sometimes in rather distant ways. But there was a shared, to some extent, a shared culture, a shared environment. We talk about the Columbian Exchange and the tragedy of so many Native Americans dying once they were exposed to European diseases like smallpox. Well, tragic as that is, that didn't happen in Africa, because the people of Africa had been exposed to smallpox through this contact with the Eurasian Old World. And so this is a constant, and it's an influential factor in the lives of Africans. Finally, and this is the last concept I want to bring up here. There's another slide on this PowerPoint, but I'm going to, I'll deal with the topics in there as we go on throughout the semester. So there is this notion, and this is fostered in part by Afrocentric thinkers, that Africa has been a place of suffering, that in fact that shared suffering is the thing that unifies all the peoples of Africa. There is even in some circles at least, a very strong notion of victimhood. And that is justified, I think, given that Africans were subjected to things like the slave trade, for many centuries. But we should talk about it. We should bring up this point that Africa has been a difficult place for human beings to thrive, and that those who did live here and managed to eke out an existence are, in their own way, rather heroic. On the other hand, if we emphasize suffering too much, it can blind us to other features of African history that are just as valuable and maybe more valuable to know about. And so we should keep this concept of suffering in mind all through our term here, while at the same time recognizing the limitations of that as a key focus. All right. Above all other things, we must emphasize that Africans had their own value system, their own ideas about what was proper and good, how societies ought to be ordered, that just because they did things differently than Europeans, that doesn't mean they were inferior, right? They did things differently. Europeans didn't recognize what Africans were doing as civilization, at least not for a long time. They thought, along with Hugh Trevor Roper, that Africa was just a place where people engaged in, to go back to his quote, the unrewarding gyrations of primitive peoples in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe, right? Well, if we dig deeper and employ in creative ways through various means a number of primary sources, we can begin to get at an understanding of Africans themselves, not from the European viewpoint, not kind of redacted through a European lens, but rather Africa on its own terms. That is our goal this semester, and so hopefully this discussion has been helpful to frame this whole semester of African history, and we will move on and begin to take up the narrative in the next class. Thank you very much.